Danger in Diablo, Chapter 2. The sun was sliding down out of sight over the edge of the western desert as Annie and Tag came in sight of Smoke Tree Station. It was only a handful of squat buildings huddled at the foot of a sun-baked hill, but it was a welcome sight to the tired travelers. Tag whooped happily. "We'll be there in 10 minutes! Watch me go!" He laid the whip to the jogging mules. "Hey, stop that!" Annie called back reprovingly. "Easy does it, young feller. Those poor things are as anxious to get there as you are, but we're not going to run their hearts out just to save a few minutes. Slow down." Tag knew she was right. He slackened the reins, but the mules just flicked their long ears and kept on at a faster pace. They were hungry, and their good mule sense told them that water and food were close at hand. "They're doing it themselves," Tag explained hastily when Annie looked accusingly at him. Target was not to be outdone by mere mules. He decided to step along faster too, and Annie let him break into a canter. Soon the whole outfit was moving along at a smart clip toward the station. "Look, Annie!" Tag was pointing off to the south as he called to her. A tiny puff of dust had appeared in a gap between the hills. It was moving rapidly along what must be a winding road. "What's that?" Annie studied it. "It seems to be some kind of a 4-horse wagon. Why, it's a stagecoach! I can see it now. It's headed toward the station." As they spoke, they both heard distant, sharp reports. "Sounds like they're shooting off firecrackers." Annie shook her head. Her face showed that she was worried. Gunfire. Tag jumped up on the seat of the wagon and shielded his eyes against the setting sun. "Indians?" He sounded as if he hoped so. "I doubt it." She had wheeled Target and was riding close to the wagon. Without realizing it, she rested her hand on the Colt in her holster. She spoke lightly. "Uncle Luke wrote that there weren't any hostile Indians around here. They're mostly all on reservations, and he says they're living up to the treaty now that their old leaders are in prison or reformed." Tag couldn't help being just a bit disappointed. An Indian raid just as he and Annie reached the safety of the stage station would have made something to write about to his old friends back home. "Anyhow, whatever the shooting meant, it seems to be all over now," Annie smiled. "Maybe whoever was chasing the stage gave up when they got inside of the station," Tag guessed. "Too bad we weren't closer. We might have got in on it." "Be glad we didn't. Don't be so bloodthirsty, young punkin," she laughed, and then added, "Probably with some cowboy passenger celebrating payday. I remember when Mother and I were with Dad at Fort Apache, we had a house at the edge of a town for a while. And on Saturday nights when the ranch hands got paid, they came to town to let off steam. The merchants boarded up their windows and all stayed indoors. After they'd spent their money, the cowboys would ride up and down just firing their guns in the air. Mother and I would hide under the bed covers." Tag chuckled. "Wouldn't have scared me," he boasted. Up ahead, the stage was approaching the station. The thick-timbered gate in the adobe wall was swinging open. Annie could see men running out to meet the stage, waving their arms in excited greeting. Then the stage rocked into the station yard, and the men at the heavy gate started to swing it shut. Annie fired 3 times in the air in rapid succession. One of the men at the gate stared in their direction, then waved an arm in reply and swung the gate wide open again. The mules stepped out briskly, and Target cantered as gaily as if he had not covered 20 miles since breakfast. It was all Annie could do to keep the hungry animals from galloping the last few hundred yards. Tag straightened his shoulders and sat up erect as he handled the reins with a flourish. Annie cast a quick glance back at him and smiled secretly. Tag always made a good entrance, just in case there were other small boys somewhere around to be impressed. Tag caught her look and grinned in reply. He knew he never fooled Annie very far. "Bet we find a lot of people here who know Uncle Luke," he called over the rattle and squeak of the wheels. "I should hope so," she called back, "seeing he's been their sheriff for the past 5 years." The short desert twilight was already fading into darkness when they reached the gate a few minutes later. As they moved into the big square unloading yard, Annie took a quick look around. If there were several wagons under the sheds, it would mean that the station was crowded. In that case, she and Tag might have to camp outside the walls tonight. To her relief, there was only an old buckboard and a buggy in the sheds, evidently belonging to the station itself. Over in front of the big rambling adobe headquarters building, the stage was unloading an excited trio of passengers. Several men in typical Western garb had gathered to greet them, and a tall, thin man in shirt sleeves hurried out of the building as she watched. He must be the superintendent of the station, she guessed, from the way he took charge and led the agitated passengers into the building. The man who had swung the gate open for her closed it now and dropped the heavy iron bar across it. He picked up a lighted lantern and handed it up to her. "Here you go, ma'am," he said briskly, then pointed toward the stables across the wide yard. "You'll find plenty of room for your critters. Help yourself to the feed and water." He started to move away hastily toward the others. "We've come a long way today," Annie called after him, trying to sound cheerful, "and we'd like somebody to give us a hand." "Be glad to help, ma'am, as soon as I get back." He retreated quickly before she could argue him into giving up the excitement of whatever was going on over at headquarters. "Was it a real hold-up?" Tag called from the wagon. "Did somebody shoot at them?" "He didn't give me time to ask," Annie answered wryly. "We'll find out all about it when, and if, he comes back. Meanwhile, we'll start unharnessing." The stables were big and roomy. Annie found clean stalls for all 3 of her animals and a good supply of water and feed. Tag, as usual, did his full share of the work, even if he did grumble a few times. "Wish that fellow'd come back and tell us what happened." But they were still alone when they finished taking care of the mules and Target, and they started over to the main building carrying their carpet bags. Annie slung her saddle over her shoulder. There was always a chance that in a strange place that someone might switch saddles, and hers was an especially fine-tooled leather one of her father's last gifts to her. They could hear excited voices through the open door of the headquarters adobe. The square blob of light from inside the room outlined a man's figure as they came up. It was the man who had left them at the gate. He saw them and stopped abruptly. "Doggone, ma'am, I'm sorry. I plumb forgot you folks and all the ruckus here." Tag couldn't hold back. "Was the stage really attacked?" "Sure was, about 2 miles out. Couple of fellers popped out of the big rocks at the bend and threw down on Zeke. He's the driver. He ain't the kind to argufy with a 6-gun, so he pulled away pronto and reached for the sky. They spilled them passengers out alongside the road, rough-like, and lined 'em up, but they didn't hurt nobody. They just took all their valuables and cussed 'em out 'cause they wasn't carrying much coin. Then they rode off." Tag was disappointed. "But we heard shooting." "That was Zeke signaling the station he'd run into trouble." Tag thought it was high time to do a little bragging. "Huh," he snorted. "It's a good thing for those outlaws they didn't try to stop us. Annie would have sent them flying." "You don't say." The stableman laughed and winked at Annie over the boy's head. "She don't look so ferocious to me." Then he sobered. In the lamplight from the open door, he noticed for the first time that she was young and pretty. "If I was you, miss, I wouldn't try to do any more traveling around here alone. We're having more than our share of outlaw trouble these days." "Thanks for the advice." Annie smiled at him. The man pointed his thumb over his shoulder at the open door. "That long, skinny feller behind the counter is Jim Castle. He's boss of the station. You take his advice and you'll be okay." He disappeared into the darkness toward the stables, and Annie led Tag inside the headquarters building. The big main room was warm and inviting after the chill of the desert night air. Its great stone fireplace was piled high with blazing juniper logs, sending a faint, pleasant perfume through the room as tiny spirals of smoke stole up along the massive face and were lost in the blackened beams. Several colorful Navajo blankets were hung on the walls, while others carpeted the rough plank floor. A huge wagon wheel hung down horizontally from the center of the ceiling, a bracket at the end of each spoke holding a lighted oil lamp with a brightly polished brass reflector. Tag could hardly take his eyes off its dazzling splendor. "Wow-wee!" he breathed. "Look at that, Annie!" But Annie's attention was centered on the group gathered at the long counter at the far end of the room. The tall, thin man behind the counter was undoubtedly the superintendent that the stableman had referred to. Glaring up at Jim Castle was a small, stout, red-faced man in a tall beaver top hat and a plaid English traveling cape of fashionable cut. He carried an ivory-headed cane with which he was pounding the counter. "What are you going to do about this outrage?" he was barking angrily. The lanky superintendent shook his head mournfully and pulled at a limp mustache that drooped almost to his chin. "Nothing we can do about it tonight, sir, but first thing in the morning." He broke off to turn to the stage driver who was standing nearby. "How about it, Zeke? Did you see their faces?" "Nope," said Zeke unhappily. "They were wearing hoods made out of horse blankets." Which same they've chucked in some gully by now," put in one of the listeners. The others nodded in agreement. "I wouldn't mind so much losing my money and my watch," the traveler complained, "but those desperados took my sample case, and I can't do any selling." "What's your line, mister?" It was the same cowboy who had spoken before. "Imported perfume, sir. Rare French extracts used by the creme de la creme of society in salons from coast to coast." "Do tell." The cowboy was puzzled. "I've been in a heap of saloons, but I'm blamed if they smelt like cologne." "My good fellow, I said salons, not saloons." "Well, whichever. It seems like the best way to catch them road agents is to keep sniffing around till we find a couple of hombres that smell too pretty." Several of the hearers snickered, and the traveling man's face turned a brighter red. Over at the fireplace, Tag giggled and nudged Annie, but she hastily laid her hand over his mouth. "Shh," she warned. The superintendent was speaking. The nearest peace officer's at Diablo, he was saying soothingly. I'll send off word to him in the morning. Tag whispered excitedly to Annie. Is he talking about Uncle Luke, do you think? She nodded and smiled. Of course, there's only one sheriff in a county. Her smile faded suddenly as the traveler's voice whipped sharply across the room. Why tell him something he knows all about now? Meanin' what? Castle's voice sounded hard and dry. You live around here. You know what everybody in Diablo says about him and his kind of law enforcement. It's the end of chapter 2. Come back next time and find out what happens next.